feel free. I mean, if anybody would like to say anything, welcome us, of course, to share any thoughts now. But I will try and start at 3:30 sharp, so that we don't lose any time. Okay, my clock says it's 5:30, and that makes it, I think, something 5:30, 15:30, so that is 3:30. What makes it close to midnight in Helsinki, so I think we'll get started at this point. Hello and welcome everyone to the panel UN Diplomacy in Times of COVID-19. My name is Bart Smit Duijzentkunst, and together with my colleague Christiane Aalborn, I co-chair the ABILA UN Law Committee, which has convened this panel. Now, in daily life, Christiane and I are both legal officers at the UN Office of Legal Affairs, and today I'll serve as your moderator. This panel is also co-sponsored by the International Organizations Interest Group of the American Society of International Law, and we are very grateful for their support. And we would also like to express our thanks to the organizers of ILW for making it possible for us all to meet this year, at least virtually. Now, on that note, I would like to mention that directly after this panel at 4:30 New York time, there will be a number of networking rooms hosted by ABILA committees, including the UN Law Committee. And of course, you're all very welcome to join us there after this panel. Okay, with these housekeeping remarks out of the way, let me turn to the theme of today's panel. When COVID-19 reached UN headquarters, meetings of all forms and sizes were cancelled, conferences postponed, and sessions moved online. The pandemic has put to the test many UN rules and procedures, including its charter. Because how do you adopt a resolution, hold an election, or monitor a mandate, all in an inclusive, transparent manner and in 6 languages, when the world is on lockdown? This panel will reflect on how the COVID-19 health crisis has affected and continues to affect multilateral diplomacy at the UN. What are the challenges of conducting negotiations from the kitchen table? How adaptive is the UN Charter at its 75th anniversary tomorrow in view of the current challenges to classic diplomacy? And how will COVID-19 shape the future of UN diplomacy? I'm absolutely delighted that today we are joined by an expert panel of lawyers and diplomats to discuss these questions. And I'll quickly introduce them here. First, we have Blanca Montejo, who is a Senior Political Affairs Officer at the Security Council Affairs Division of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the United Nations. Next, we have Keiichiro Okimoto, who is a legal officer at the Office of the Legal Counsel at the Office of Legal Affairs of the United Nations. We are also joined by Pablo Arrocha, who is a legal advisor of at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the United Nations. And we're joined from Helsinki, furthest away for this panel, Professor Jan Klabbers, who is Professor of International Law at the University of Helsinki, and of course a renowned scholar of international organizations law. This panel will take place in 2 rounds, followed by a Q&A. In the first round, the panelists will each have about 5 minutes to look back at how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected their work in the past half year, providing personal experiences to illustrate some of the dilemmas that UN officials and diplomats are facing. And in the second round, we will be looking ahead, asking what lessons have been learned and how the pandemic might affect the future of multilateral diplomacy at the United Nations. And after these 2 rounds, we'll take some time for discussions and questions and answers. If you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to drop those in the chat box at any point. I will be keeping an eye on the time, and I will try and signal to the speakers when the time is up. But without further ado, let me open the first round of questions. And I'll do that by asking, how has the pandemic affected your work? And what are some of the most significant challenges that you and your colleagues have had to overcome? And how did you go about it? Let me first give the floor to Blanca. Blanca, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bart. And thank you, Christian, for the invitation. Thank you as well to the organizers. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be joining my co-panelists, very distinguished academics and practitioners. So I will be speaking today from the perspective of the Security Council. And I have to underline, it's actually a requirement that I am delivering these words on my personal capacity, and that any opinion expressed does not necessarily represent the opinion of the United Nations or the opinion of the Security Council, of course. So I'll focus on this first question, Bart, that you've posed to us, and mainly on the impact of COVID-19 as it has affected the work of my colleagues, of me, and the Security Council Affairs Division of the work of the Security Council. So the outbreak of COVID-19 is probably one of the most impactful events in the history of the Security Council. No other event has affected directly the work, I'd say the operations of the Council, as this one. Despite the fact that it has been extremely impactful, the Council has been able to maintain its activity throughout the crisis and actually to continue delivering on its important mandate. In fact, I'd say it's the only principal organ of the UN that has been able to do so. However, this doesn't mean that it was easy or that it hasn't changed dramatically what we have been doing, we were doing up until then. So the procedures and practice that had developed and were commonplace for the members of the Security Council prior to March 2020, and that were developed painstakingly, I'd say, from the early 1946 until today, have now changed dramatically and have caused very important modifications in how the Council functions. So first, while the Council used to hold meetings in the chamber and physically, The Council also held meetings elsewhere, as someone in the audience know, as a result of a decision of the Council to meet elsewhere. The last time was in 2004 in Nairobi, for example. But now the Council decided rapidly to transition into holding video conferences. And the same happened actually with consultations, which used to happen in the consultations room, as it is known to all of us. And now they actually take place in closed video teleconferences. So while these VTCs, as we call them, are not considered formal meetings of the Council, there were some concerns about security, multilingualism, etc. This had been actually the key vehicle for the Council to maintain its activity in relation to most of the items on its agenda. So now that the Council can actually go back to the chamber, so the model that the Council has developed is a hybrid one, alternating in-person meetings and VTCs. As of 14 July, the Council has been meeting in the ECOSOC chamber, combining that with VTCs. And actually, as of October, as of 8th of October, the Council has returned to the chamber. I'd say that even, meetings as relevant as the annual report, annual open debate on working methods took place over a VTC on 15 May, or a recent summit on 24 September on governance post-COVID also took place over VTC. Again, this would not be considered a formal meeting of the Council, but it continues to be, it continues to demonstrate how the Council has maintained its activity through these other means. 20 October, for example, there was a meeting on the comprehensive review of the situation in the Persian Gulf. So as you can see, the Council has found a way, an effective way of actually continuing its activity. But the notions, the legal notions, the concepts that we knew up until March have changed dramatically. Secondly, I'd say that while the Council used to vote on most draft resolutions in the chamber by representatives raising their hands, as we have seen in so many photos, it added a new voting procedure through written means for resolutions and 24-hour non-objection procedures for PRSTs. All of this is combined then with some form of public announcement, a VTC again, even though this took a while to actually put into place. So there were some resolutions that were adopted without an open VTC, so to speak. So this is a manifest innovation, one that is not prevented for. There is no objection in the Charter. Article 27 of the Charter allows for votes, and it doesn't predetermine how those votes should take place. So agreement in the Council was reached in order to do so, to find an alternative, and a written procedure was devised. So now the Council is operating again, like with meetings, in a hybrid form, combining in-person adoptions with written votes. And I think that it will do so for the foreseeable future in light of the evolution of the pandemic. And thirdly, I'll highlight, as you mentioned, Bart, earlier, that while the Council used to operate in the 6 official languages, VTCs have taken place mostly in English, with some attempts to introduce technology for interpretation during those VTCs, and then some attempts as well of some Council members to actually use their own languages, as France did during its presidency in June, or Niger during its presidency in September. And consultations actually have taken place in English, and there is no interpretation. So that is a significant change. Other changes have affected other formats of the meetings, specific ones like private meetings, where, for example, the ICJ president would come and brief the Council. That would have been a private meeting. Now it's a closed VTC, or the meetings with the 2 contributing countries that are taking place in closed VTCs. I could go on and on. Everything has basically transitioned to the online environment, with the consequences, as I say, in terms of modifying the concepts that we knew up until then. And then in terms of substance, I'd say that, as I said at the outset, the Council has been able to continue its work, and it has continued to pass critical resolutions, including Resolution 2532, which many in the audience probably know, the famous COVID resolution, so to speak. It took a while, but the Council managed to express support to the SG's call for a global ceasefire, and demanded a general and immediate cessation of hostilities in all situations on its agenda. And I'd highlight as well other resolutions of importance this year. I'd say that the resolution on youth, peace and security, 2535, or women in peace operations during the presidency of Indonesia in August, were clear milestones in the history of the Council in terms of new resolutions. So there is no doubt that the crisis has shaken certain assumptions that we had, but it has opened the door for future reflection and reinvention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blanca. Yeah, and hold that thought. That's what we're going to come to the next session. Thank you very much. Kei, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Bart. So what I'd like to do in this limited time that we have is, to maybe say a few words from the perspective of the Office of Legal Affairs of the United Nations, and just to highlight some work that we've done in assisting intergovernmental organs to continue functioning during the COVID-19 pandemic. Just as a background, the Office of Legal Affairs has a small team that deals with questions concerning the rules of procedure of UN organs and institutional law of the United Nations. And I'm part of that team, and we have been actually directly involved in finding ways for UN organs to continue functioning during this pandemic. So as Bart said, at the UN headquarters here in New York, by mid-March, it was no longer possible to hold intergovernmental meetings with physical presence in conference rooms. But actually, spring and early summer is a busy period for the UN. Like the General Assembly has to elect non-permanent members of the Security Council and members of the Economic and Social Council, and they have to adopt and approve the budget of peacekeeping operations. So there was really an urgent need to find a way to allow UN organs to continue functioning, even though the pandemic was really having a serious effect on New York City. And I'd like to give some examples of measures that were taken in the General Assembly. So the first thing that the GA had to do is to find a way to adopt decisions without in-person meetings. And this was quite unusual for the General Assembly because it doesn't have a practice to adopt decisions without in-person meetings. So our office, we consulted the General Assembly Secretariat and also the Office of the President of the General Assembly. And we came up with several options, and it quickly became clear that, what we call silence procedure was the most viable option, whereby the President of the General Assembly would circulate draft decisions to all member states for at least 72 hours. And if there was no objection during that period, the draft decisions were considered adopted. So our office actually drafted the decision on silence procedure, which was adopted by the General Assembly at the end of March, and which was actually extended multiple times until it expired at the end of August. And this actually worked pretty well as long as there was consensus amongst member states on draft decisions. The problem was when there wasn't any consensus, because one objection by a member state could prevent the adoption of the draft decision. Now, in usual in-person meetings, in such cases, any member state can actually request a vote on that draft decision, but there was simply no mechanism to take vote without in-person meetings at the General Assembly. So what we did was, in consultation with our colleagues, we suggested several options, and we also drafted a decision on voting without in-person meetings of the General Assembly. And our colleagues in the General Assembly Secretariat actually created an online system that would allow member states to vote online. And member states, held a number of informal consultations in May and June, but there was no consensus on the draft decision, so that draft decision was not adopted. The other issue that Bart, you mentioned too, was about the elections. So that was another issue that the GA had to address urgently, and especially the elections of the non-permanent members, the Security Council, and members of the Economic and Social Council, which usually take place in June. And elections are held by secret ballot, which requires the presence of delegates in the General Assembly Hall and cast their ballots in in-person meeting of the General Assembly. But in-person meetings were simply not possible for the General Assembly back in June. So again, our office, helped the General Assembly Secretariat to come up with, several options and to draft, a decision that would enable the General Assembly to hold elections without in-person meetings. And according to the adopted draft decision, a limited number of delegates could come to the General Assembly Hall to cast their ballots during a specific, time slot. And once they have cast their ballots, they had to leave the General Assembly Hall immediately in order to avoid any crowd in the General Assembly Hall. And this actually worked pretty well. The General Assembly managed to elect the required members of the General Assembly and the Security Council, the members of the Security Council and members of the Economic and Social Council. And this actually was served as a model for subsequent elections that were held in August and September, for example, with respect to the judges of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea and members of the Human Rights Committee in September. So these were just, some of the examples I wanted to sort of share with you, where, I was personally involved in, finding ways for the UN organs to, continue with the important work during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much, Kei. And it's indeed interesting to hear that essentially by using the silence procedure, you sort of give everybody a veto almost, and that creates its own issues. And yes, and thank you very much for your help, because I know my colleagues at Duijzentkunst, the Division for Ocean Affairs Law of the Sea, were very grateful for your assistance with the election of the ILW's judges. In fact, the meeting of states parties, I think that normally takes place over a couple of days in June. This year opened by letter in July, then held some in-person sessions indeed for the elections in August, and is formally still ongoing, as I understand, as we speak. So it has had a profound effect, and thanks to people like you, we've managed to keep the system running, and Blanca, of course, for the Security Council. Pablo, I wanted to turn to you to hear the experience from the other side, from the perspective of the delegates. Could you explain to us how you've experienced the last half year?
Absolutely, Bart. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm delighted to be joining this panel. And I'm also very happy to be following Blanca and Kei, because indeed they've set the scene of what we inherited as delegates in order to operate. And in this first round, I wanted to put forward first two premises upon which we operated, and then to tell a little bit of the anecdotes and the examples of the things that we had to navigate through. So the first premise is that one of the challenges that we understood very quickly, and that became the ongoing question that was always on the back of our heads of what to do, was that in a situation where you have a global pandemic, where everything has stopped, and where the world needs a unified response for that, and where that normally means the United Nations, because that represents the world, coming together to take action, you suddenly have an institution that has its doors closed, where you cannot meet, and it cannot operate. So the first premise was how to make sure that the UN can deliver when it is needed the most, despite the fact that we cannot come to the building in First Avenue, and how do we do that? The second thing is that to a large extent, success in diplomacy depends on personal contact, personal connections, personal interaction. And the one thing that this pandemic has done is it has stripped us from that personal connection. So it's very difficult for us diplomats to now do our work and deliver when the one thing that normally we use the most in order to get to agreements is taken away from us. So with these two premises in mind, then now we can get to this scenario where we have the rules that Blanca and Kei were talking about, and those are just given to us as the only tools that we have, with the question of, well, solve this, do something, the world is watching, we want you to deliver. And so the first anecdote I wanted to touch upon, or an example, was the process that we went through for the adoption of the first substantive resolution in the General Assembly on COVID-19. There was a Mexican proposal. It was a General Assembly resolution on the access to vaccines, medical equipment, and medical services for all. and it was a resolution that was already adopted under the rules that Kei described with the silence procedure in place. The decision for silence procedure was decision 74/544. And the resolution that the General Assembly adopted via silence procedure, a substantive resolution on COVID, was adopted on the 20th of April. It was resolution 74/274. And this was a very interesting exercise to participate in, basically because we couldn't negotiate a text. So that made us have to go back pretty much in time to an exercise where all the heavy burden was in writing, and in good writing, how to make a good draft, but not only the draft of the resolution, how also to make good letters to communicate what is it that we were doing to delegations, and to try to ensure transparency in this process and openness, given the fact that we knew that we didn't have the possibility to negotiate as we normally do. And by that time, and we're talking, again, if the resolution was adopted on the 20th of April, we're talking about very early in the times of the lockdown. And many of the platforms that now have become our daily life back then were still being either explored, tested. Now it's common that we have virtual consultations informally like this, but in March, in April, that was not the case. So that implied a lot of work, of course, via phone conversations with colleagues, but it was a very, very careful and calibrated exercise of drafting for something that, as Kei mentioned, the only little downside of silence procedure is that you're de facto giving a veto to 193 member states. So it's not a minor thing, especially when you're going into areas that at the time were also being very controversial. So one of the elements that was key, I think, in assuring the adoption of the resolution where we were in these last stages, there was a first draft. We explained it to delegations. We tried to hear views and gather views, and then we made very small, like the minimal corrections that we could to the text to try to disrupt it the least that we could. And then the big exercise, almost replacing votes, was us engaging in an exercise to get co-sponsors. And we knew that if we gathered many co-sponsors, that would de facto implicitly mean that we were getting these votes visibly, and then putting more pressure on those who potentially could break silence to assume the political cost of doing this. And that is why we became very active, almost as if it was a candidature in getting co-sponsorship. And we ended up with 179 co-sponsors for this resolution by the time it went into silence procedure. And that was a game changer, really, in the dynamics when it was going through these 72 hours, which, believe me, 72 hours under these conditions for me was like an eternity to see that it was adopted. And to be fair, and just to explain how difficult this was the only substantive resolution on COVID-19 via silence procedure that the General Assembly could adopt. There were many proposals. The silence was broken on all of the others, to the point that the PGA at some point appointed a coordinator to facilitate some sort of omnibus resolutions for these other initiatives. So this was not a minor thing, the adoption of resolution 74/274. Very quickly, I would also mention that we're still in that process of navigating how to operate as delegates. As we speak, we have the 6th committee ongoing with a hybrid format where we have the most plenary in-person meetings for debates from all of the committees. There were 22 in the program of work for this year, including one that is actually ongoing now across the street from where I'm sitting in the office. But there are still many questions up in the air, in particular questions with something that Blanca reiterated a lot, which is the formal character of meetings that happen virtually, and that there's no agreement on that. So from a practical point of view, everything that happens virtually, although it might advance our work, continues to be informal, and therefore there's no registration of what is going on. And this has led also delegations to have two approaches to this. One group of delegations who believe that all substantive negotiations should only take place in person, and they will not engage in negotiations which are in substance being held virtually, and others that are more ready to endorse this mechanism. And of course, there are many other examples and questions that arise, how to ensure transparency, how to ensure equality of opportunities with bad connections, how to ensure security of the platforms, how to ensure compliance and adherence to the rules of procedure. And then not only with the UN, but we're also engaged, for example, in joint negotiations between The Hague and New York in the context of the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court. And this now has become one abstract venue that we operate in virtually, that has also changed the dynamic of this dichotomy between The Hague and New York. So there are many things to be said. We don't have that much time to go into these details, but at least I wanted to put this on the table to explain how indeed we're still in a way learning and improvising and finding a way to move forward with a session that looks like many resolutions heading towards technical rollovers because of that lack of opportunity to negotiate substance virtually. So that's where we are. I think I'm somewhere in my 5 minutes for the first round, and so I'll stop here, Bart.
Thank you very much, Pablo. And that was an extremely insightful look into how diplomats have to adopt their work. Professor Klabbers, as we've said, you're a little bit more distanced, both in space and as a scholar from the practice. But we'd be really interested to hear your reflections on what you've heard, and maybe on how that makes you reflect on the role of international organizations today.
Well, thank you for, first of all, for your invitation, Bart and Christiana. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm learning a lot as you guys are speaking. I'm avidly making notes. I have to prepare a new edition of my International Organizations Introduction book. So I guess it will have to have at least a section on the COVID emergency procedures in international organizations. I am not a diplomat, that's clear. I am neither formally a diplomat, nor do I have any talent for diplomacy. But I write about diplomacy and I teach future diplomats. So I thought I'd do my first contribution a bit on how research and teaching are affected. In a sense, research is not much affected, not immediately. Like it's a solitary profession. It comes with social distancing built in, one might say. And that's fine, like whether I sit at home or whether I sit in my office reading a book or writing one, that's hardly relevant. And still, in the longer run, I think research does get affected a bit, somewhat prosaically, because libraries have been closed for a while, archives might be closed, might be far more difficult to visit. Also because you learn things from your colleagues at the water cooler and the coffee machine, and that's no longer quite as easily done. But the main thing, perhaps, this meeting is an exception, but most meetings that would take place earlier physically and last 2 days are now spread out over 8 or 10 sessions in 8 or 10 weeks, which means that your concentration gets interrupted with the same stuff, not just 2 days, but 8 or 10 times. And I've learned the hard way that research is only possible if you can sort of sit down for a while and concentrate. So that's not really helping. As far as teaching goes, we have moved in Helsinki, and I think in most places, we've moved largely online. Helsinki has been reasonably well off. We have a reasonably sensible government here. So the lockdown has not been total. The pandemic has struck, but has not struck as badly as elsewhere. But still, most teaching has been going online, which means that it's difficult as a teacher to inspire people. You can't really inspire people online. You need proximate contact to do that. The craft aspect of teaching, the master-pupil sort of thing, like I can explain face-to-face things that I cannot really explain in a large group because I have to contextualize, have to personalize. That part is a lot more difficult. And the loneliness gets to students. And you can tell that when they log in, they often log into a seminar just to see people. Like at the worst of the lockdown, we continued our regular seminar, and people would just log in, wouldn't say a word, but would just look somewhat mixture of dazed and happy. Dazed because it was a lockdown, but happy to have some human contact other than with maybe their parents or something. And you can tell that gets to people. So in the longer run, if this continues, then the prospects are bleak, I guess. Maybe I leave it at this for the moment and allow us to go to the next stage.
Thank you very much, Professor Klabbers. And I wonder how much that sentiment of students logging in to have some human contact also applies to diplomats and UN officials. Okay, in the interest of time, I'd like to move straight away to the second round of questions, where we'll be looking at ahead. So I'll ask one question for all panelists again, which is, what do you think will be some of the lasting events, effects, positive or negative, of the pandemic on your work and on UN diplomacy in general, and maybe including on sort of some of the legitimacy of the procedures that you've just you just mentioned, and that has come up a little bit already, but to the extent you're able to comment on that, we'd be really interested to hear. We'll take the same order. Blanca, can I give you the floor?
Sure, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we would need a couple of days to continue digging deeper, but let me do this in 5 minutes. So I am somehow less pessimistic. I think that COVID-19 is a major crisis that is affecting the reality of all of us, but it is also an enormous opportunity actually to rethink and reconsider the way diplomacy and UN staff supporting diplomats are working, have worked and will work in the future. For me, I see 4 main areas of opportunity, I'd say. I think that diplomacy may certainly become more efficient. Meetings among nations may take place rapidly and in response to rapidly evolving crises. This obviously a new generation will take over and new ways of doing business will inevitably emerge. Not that Pablo is old generation, he's certainly new generation, but it will challenge us all to reinvent ourselves and to think about how we do business in a different way. In the past, for example, a meeting of the Council required a series of locales, persons, logistics to be in place, and in the absence of such conditions, the Council could not meet. And we've seen it, we've lived it. So the virtual environment has made meetings, even if sometimes clunky and do you hear me, easier to hold, faster to convene. For example, during the presidency of the Dominican Republic in April, the president of the Council at the time would join the VTCs, this activity of the Council, from the capital, from Santo Domingo. There is no doubt that technology needs to evolve, that our concepts need to evolve with it and show the full potential of our imagination and our capacity to apply technology to develop a new way of doing diplomacy. But a lot has already been achieved, I'd say. And the crisis, I think, will accelerate the change, a change that is, we're almost at the portal of a new era. So somehow seeing how the new era would look like. The second point I would raise is that it may become more effective by actually responding more rapidly and more directly, even by eliminating the need to go to the field to do so, as it used to be. And with this, I'm not underestimating the importance of going to the field and going to the ground and the human contact. But now contact with the field can be enhanced by getting closer to those living through a conflict or a crisis. The Council already now, only 8 months into the crisis, has been encouraged to consider the possibility of undertaking virtual missions. So imagining how that could work and the potential for such medium to enhance the impact of the Council, in my view, is enormous. So directly addressing the parties to a conflict, for example, using virtual reality or, meeting non-state actors, which used to be a very difficult endeavor. I mean, not let alone security considerations, but actually getting there. So again, I think that imagination combined with technology may bring forward solutions that were unthinkable only 8 months ago. So again, I think that the crisis is certainly pressing the gas on the development of new solutions and working methods. It's up to us to catch up with the changes, the carpet on which we were walking is certainly moving. The third point I would raise is that it may become more transparent. This is something that Pablo has touched upon, but I'm seeing it from the perspective of the Council. By being able to make available as much information as possible, the Council has decided, for example, to webcast all of its VTCs, which, as I say, They're not considered formal meetings of the Council, but nonetheless they're webcast. And that decision was taken very early on with no political objection. And new compilation of statements delivered in those non-formal meetings are also made available to the public. It's true that there are delays. It's true that they could be made available earlier, but nonetheless there is transparency. And so I think that embracing transparency in everything that international organizations do is actually a welcome development. And I think that new data will be generated as a result of more eyeballs paying attention to what international organizations are doing. And the fourth and last would be that it may become more agile and more resilient. And here, while this crisis has been enormously difficult, and it's still being very difficult for all of us, it could have been worse, much, much worse. So, the virus could have been more lethal, the contagion much more rapid and dangerous, and the threat could have been even purposeful, let's say a chemical attack, a bacteriological attack. So without wanting to sound too catastrophic here, and unless humanity, all of us, is seriously invested in preventing it, I think that we're all conscious that the climate future may impose on us to become much more resilient and agile, because this crisis may become ever more frequent and graver. So from a human perspective, I think it has, at least as far as I'm concerned, and from what I've seen in the Council, it has made us more sensitive to the risks of the future. And to a certain extent, I think it has made us be better prepared, with failures, of course, for similar crises. And it has also made evident what happens when, at the national, local, international level, authorities do not collaborate. So my hope is that this crisis will turn into a lesson learned, and that diplomacy of the future will become more agile and adaptive. I would say as well that the crisis has opened the door to re-examine on the substance the evolving nature of threats to international peace and security. And I think that to name a few of the themes discussed this year in the Council really speaks for itself. The Council has discussed climate and security. It has discussed the humanitarian effects of environmental degradation. It has discussed pandemics and the challenges of sustaining peace. It has discussed global governance post-COVID. So I think that substantively, the Council has been sensitized to a changing reality. And the last point I wanted to make is that the SG has spoken about three main elements for the future of multilateral cooperation, which are that multilateral cooperation will have to become networked, inclusive, and transparent. And I think that the COVID pandemic has offered a glimpse into what this future could look like. And so now it's up to us to figure out the means to best achieve it. And diplomacy will have a key role, certainly, to play in it. My last point is to your first point, Bart, on the Charter. On the UN Charter, coming from Charter Research Branch, which is the branch where I work within the Security Council Affairs Division, I think the Charter has demonstrated its ability to withstand solidly the passage of time. I would refer only to Articles 28 and 30 of the Charter, which set the parameters for the functioning of the Council. And it has proven flexible enough to allow all these shenanigans, if I may call it, all these ways of these new operations. And for this crisis, for a crisis like COVID-19, not to even scratch the bodywork of the Council. And so I think for member states, it is to continue embracing and defending the adaptability that was so wisely designed in the Charter 75 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blanca, and also thank you for this positive note, which is so much needed in these times. Kei, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you, Bart. I think what I'll do is maybe to just focus my comments on the potential impact of this pandemic on the future intergovernmental meetings of the United Nations. I think that it's obviously actually difficult to predict what kind of lasting impact this pandemic might have on the UN organs in the future, because we're still in the midst of pandemic. But at this point in time, it seems to me that the traditional format of holding formal meetings and taking decisions in in-person meetings has not been completely replaced by a new format, like meetings on a virtual platform. And it seems that member states generally feel that any adjustments made to this traditional format are really temporary in nature. So like, in the General Assembly, as I mentioned earlier, it adopted a decision to apply silence procedure to adopt, decisions outside in-person meetings. But that was only valid for 1 month at a time, and it was not actually extended beyond August. And it's the same with the General Assembly decision on holding elections outside in-person meetings. That was only applicable to elections that were held back in June, and it was not a permanent arrangement. So, as I said at the beginning, it's sort of, difficult to predict, the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic on future work of the UN organs. There might be need to, further adjust the traditional format that I just explained. And, there might be another pandemic in the future. So what I think is important is that, to continue to think about, how intergovernmental organs can continue functioning during, pandemic situations. And I think here we can actually learn from the past. And I'm actually thinking of the avian flu, which spread in a number of countries in the mid-2000s. And of course, avian flu was not as lethal as, COVID-19, but it was the spread of avian flu that actually prompted the Secretary General to submit a report to the General Assembly, highlighting the potential impact of a pandemic on the work of the United Nations. And that was back in 2007. And that report actually outlined 4 scenarios depending on the gravity of, the pandemic. And the third scenario, which was characterized as high impact, was described as follows. And I just want to read the relevant part of this report because it's actually quite interesting. So it says, public life and business in New York City are significantly affected by the pandemic, with significant absenteeism resulting in disruptions to many types of services. In this emergency situation, the UN will be officially closed, with only a small number of staff performing critical functions reporting for work. For health and safety reasons, the access of other than critical personnel to the complex would be suspended. So, this was back in 2007. Already, it sounds, like pretty similar to the situation we were in between March and August this year. And the report also actually identified, several critical functions that needed to continue under pandemic situation. And the first one was actually the ability of the principal organs, i.e. the Security Council and the General Assembly, to conduct critical meetings. So already back in 2007, the need to continue with the work of the UN organs in a pandemic situation was recognized. But the focus of the report was actually about how much additional budget will be needed for the work of the UN organ to continue under a pandemic condition. So the report actually sets out the need for such items like the teleconference facilities for the Security Council and protective equipment for staff members. The General Assembly itself also actually adopted 2 resolutions in 2007, 2009, highlighting the importance of business continuity in the event of pandemic. But it seems like there was no further discussion on how UN organs should continue functioning in a pandemic situation, including how to take decisions in the event that they were not able to hold, in-person meetings. And when you look back at March, when the pandemic started having a serious impact on New York City, the General Assembly and UN organs really did not have much guidance to rely on. So in this sense, I think it's important actually to continue thinking about how UN organs can function in the event of a pandemic situation, building on our experience in the past 7 months.
Thank you, Kei, and also for explaining to us that sometimes we need to look back to look forward, and indeed many lessons are still to learn. Pablo, floor over to you.
Thank you. And again, I think many of the elements I wanted to share might seem a little bit repetitive with what we have heard. Perhaps there's a slightly different angle to them, but I think I share the sentiment that I'm looking at this more positively than negatively. So in terms of consequences, I thought of four things, and the first thing is the only negative one, so to speak, that I thought of that I wanted to put first. Because it's also important to acknowledge those and to tackle them. And that is that, of course, I think that this crisis and the deficiencies that we've seen in the UN system so far in general have allowed also to more and to the increase of attacks to the UN, to multilateralism. And we're living under times in which the general environment globally has been an attack on multilateralism. And so these type of crises serve the purpose for those who are trying to find these pretexts to prove how maybe the UN should be something of the past, which I completely, of course, do not agree with. And I support what Blanca has said, that the UN Charter has proved that we are still here and still operating under those rules and that it is still relevant. So I would focus then on the 3 points of consequences that I think we should be doing, and I hope that we will be doing at some point. One, I think it's not contingent to the UN or to diplomacy, but I do hope that this reality leads us to a reassessment of our regular office costumes and how we do business as usual, being in the private sector, in the public. To think of the dynamics that we have and which are the ones that are really important for our work to be efficient and effective, and which ones are not. And so I think that is also a homework that we all will have to do and to take into consideration a little bit more seriously, which doesn't mean just moving all the way to home office the whole time. I don't think that's the answer either. And in my personal case, I didn't have simply a desk and a chair at home to work, and that has been very challenging also from the home office perspective. But I think there's a lot to think about. But moving more specifically into diplomacy in the UN, I think the second point, which is positive as a reassessment that I hope this leads to, is that we make a little bit of a cleanup of what is actually the relevant work that we have to be doing. And I think that touches upon a little bit of what Blanca was saying of making us more to the point and more focused. We had seen a trend in last years where the agenda of delegates and of the UN, it's becoming unmanageable and overwhelming, because many delegations, be it because of the pressure they have from capitals or a particular interest given a political juncture, want to do side events and they want to bring more topics to the agenda of the General Assembly. And many years ago, you could see how there were waves of work in the General Assembly, of how there were the months that were very intense, things would be quiet and then intense again with the opening of the General Assembly in September. Now we've almost lost those waves. Now it seems like we're in a continuum of intensity with meetings all over the place. And something that this pandemic has shown is that clearly we didn't do 90%, if not more, of those meetings. And the world didn't collapse, and our world didn't collapse, and the topics didn't collapse, and things still move forward, which basically means that we can clean up a little bit our own agenda and reassess which are the really important meetings that we should have and how to have them, and what are the other things that we're doing just to fill in that space and that need for other purposes, which are not necessarily the focused ones that we should be tackling. And the last point that I would reinforce as a positive one is that I really hope that this also leads to a reassessment of our rules of procedure and methods of work. I think that, yes, the Charter has served a great purpose, but when you move it down to the procedural aspects, there are lots of gaps, because the rules of procedure are indeed crafted in a way that addresses older type of diplomacy. There's nothing virtual, there's nothing cyber, there's nothing digital, there's nothing there that allows us to operate. This creates these continued discussions on whether we can actually have a video message in the General Assembly being part of the official records or not, because there's not a delegate in the room asking for the floor. And there was a huge discussion on this just to be able to have the high-level segment in the General Assembly. As Kei mentioned, the negotiation on an e-voting procedure did not succeed in the summer, but now there's a new draft resolution that has been put forward by delegations registered today with an e-voting process that will have to be negotiated and probably voted. So in conclusion and in one sentence, I think the point is that maybe we don't have to change all the modalities, but because I know that many delegations will want this to be over so that we can go back and do business as we do it. It's not that we have to change all of our modalities, but to make sure that we have in place good contingency plans to operate and to make the institution be the UN as an institution that is living up to the standards of the 21st century, that has rules of procedure and mechanisms that makes it one that is fully operational in the circumstances that we might face in the 21st century and going forward. So I see this, as Blanca said, more as an opportunity to go into these issues rather than as a negative aspect of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Again, really an uplifting message. Jan, can I, or Professor Klabbers, I should say, can I pass the floor to you?
You can call me Jan, Bart, if I can call you Bart. Of course, how shall I put this? I don't disagree with anything anyone has said before, but of course it's my job description to every now and then be a bit more critical, a bit more pessimistic, perhaps a bit more negative. Plus I'm Dutch, and a famous Dutchman once said, every advantage has its disadvantage. Johan Cruyff, as you might realize. So I'm going to sketch three things briefly, which might be less optimistic. One of those is the setting of diplomacy. It is well established that the shape of a room, for instance, the way the tables are arranged, the way the furniture is arranged, has an effect of sorts on the facility of reaching agreement. The horseshoe table is a horseshoe-shaped table, not for nothing. There's a reason for it. And the revolutionaries in France in 1789 quickly figured out that the way to start a popular revolution would be to build a proper assembly with facilities for communication. And of course, online, that is less clearly available. We do what we can, we muddle through, you guys muddle through, I just watch. But it's not quite the same, perhaps. And in the longer run, that might affect the ability to reach agreement on substantive matters, which can be very vital, bringing an end to poverty, bringing an end to climate change, or at least slowing it down considerably, etc. So that's one thing. The second, and that was already highlighted, I think, by Blanca when she mentioned in the first round, that the Security Council conversation has been conducted to a large extent in English at the moment. There will be states that are linguistically a bit disadvantaged. There are states that are technologically a bit disadvantaged. There are states which have small delegations. Those people cannot be in the same Zoom or in different Zoom meetings at the same time. And you can probably claim that attending Zoom meetings is easier than attending meetings in person. And maybe it is, but nonetheless, the resources of some of the smaller states in particular might be more limited. So that's something at the very least to be taken into account. And then the third is that everything, like every advantage has its disadvantage, everything comes with opportunity costs. If we fight a war on COVID, we might be so focused on fighting a war on COVID that we stop trying to protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, for instance, or any other topic that is high on the agenda. And I can think of a few. So we also need to recall that political priorities should be reassessed every now and then as well. It's one thing to fight a COVID crisis when it's ongoing and there's basically no other choice, but to get caught up in that terminology, to get caught up in that rhythm is maybe not the best possible way of going about things. And in the end, that's a brief conclusion perhaps. The pandemic sort of emphasizes the fragility of our rationality. What on earth do I mean by that? I start to sound like an academic all of a sudden. What I mean is that we tend to believe, as a species, that we organize things in terms of tasks and functions and positions and effective and efficient. Like we build a machinery that runs by itself most of the time. There are people who know what they do and which roles they have to fulfill. And what now becomes clear is that we often forget the human element, the water cooler, the interaction that Pablo mentioned, which is such a vital ingredient of diplomacy, the personal chemistry or the absence of personal chemistry. I don't have the time to tell the story, but there is a wonderful story about Woodrow Wilson being so upset with Henry Cabot Lodge that he refused Lodge's help to get the Covenant of the League of Nations through the Senate, which is an example perhaps of how personal chemistry negatively affected the course of history. And there are all those invisible tasks that people do that grease the wheels of our rationally designed machines. And if we only meet online and if we can't communicate and talk and have lunch or coffee or just whatever, chat in the elevator, then all those things might be just a little bit less well functioning. It's like a car that we forget to put the oil in every now and then. At some point, it'll give up on us. And that's something perhaps to bear in mind. Leave it at this.
Thank you very much, Professor Klabbers, and also for highlighting that human element that indeed sort of sometimes gets lost in all the virtual meetings. We have only about 2 minutes before we have to close the panel. So unfortunately, we don't really have questions time for questions. But if there's anything that any of the speakers would like to add, a last note, we have about half a minute for each of you. So I'd like to just anybody who'd like to take the floor. Feel free.
In 30 seconds, to emphasize what Professor Klabbers just said, we've seen in many processes, and in particular, for example, virtual hearings for the election of prosecutor of the ICC, the technical challenges that people might have depending on where they are in the world. And definitely, I would stress the fact, and I agree that this has shown how there's a need to bring equality when it comes to digital technology in the world. Absolutely. We have to forget that not everyone is working with the same conditions we have here in New York, for sure.
Thank you very much, Pablo. If, with the permission of the panelists, I will start to wrap up because we have to close down in the next 2 minutes. So let me just thank everybody very much for their participation and their insights. This has really been a fantastic discussion, and I'm afraid we could have gone on for a couple of more hours. But unfortunately, we probably haven't seen the end of the pandemic yet. So we might be able to do a similar panel like this next year. And we'll let you know. Well, thank you very much for all your contributions. Thanks again to the organizers of ILW and Arbitration Place for hosting us today. And I would just like to remind all participants and attendees that there will be a networking room for the UN Law Committee right after this session. And with that, I would like to close this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bart.